Um, I'm Anne Reedshaw and I'm a volunteer at Friends of the Dales. As Victoria said, I'm leading the campaign to increase biodiversity by improving the management of roadside verges with particular focus on the Yorkshire Dales. And we've recently renamed our campaign Living Verges, a slightly snappier title. So first of all, a little bit about Friends of the Dales. Friends of the Dales is a registered charity established over 40 years ago, campaigning to protect the Yorkshire Dales. We're funded by our members, by supporters and through legacies. And we run a Dales Bus social enterprise, which basically funds a bus service that links with other public transport services in local towns and large villages, enabling people to travel to the Dales on public transport rather than bringing their cars, or it increases access to the Dales for people who don't have their own car. And that runs throughout the summer months, usually at weekends and bank holidays. Another recent notable achievement has been the Capturing the Past project, which has involved a 3-year project in the Ingleborough Dales, looking at archiving, looking at community archives and digitalising their local history and putting all the information into a digital format, which can then be accessed by the public through a new website. And the mission statement of Friends of the Dales is to be the leading voice campaigning for a sustainable future for the Yorkshire Dales. And we all know how marvellous the Yorkshire Dales are with their unique landscapes and their wildlife, their cultural heritage, and of course the communities and the people, as well as the visitors. So the aim of Friends of the Dales is to protect all those vital ingredients so that they're there for future generations to enjoy. So just again, illustrating some of the campaigns that Friends of the Dales has been involved with. There's the Dales Bus that I mentioned. There's the Capturing the Past project that I mentioned. As well as that, we campaign for affordable housing for local people, so protecting the local communities, as well as protecting the landscape and trying to encourage the use of rail, for example, to take quarried stone out of the Dales so that there aren't so many huge lorries on the roads. And then more recent campaigns, as Victoria said, we've got the plastics campaign, which is trying to reduce the amount of waste plastics in the park. So especially focusing on the plastic tree guards that are going up around a lot of the recent trees that have been planted, and trying to find reasonable alternatives. And as well as that, trying to perhaps remove and recycle some of the plastic tree guards that are there already that aren't needed anymore because the trees have already grown big enough. Then there's the very new peatlands campaign, which Victoria mentioned, which is trying to protect the very valuable peat resource that we have in the Yorkshire Dales and the uplands, which is becoming increasingly importantly recognised as a source, as a store of carbon. And there are many different angles to this campaign going on at the moment, and we're very supportive of those. And then, of course, there's the Living Verges campaign, which I'm going to talk about. So first of all, a little bit of a background about me. I'm a biologist by training. My PhD was in plant science, and I've worked as a scientist in industry and in academia at the University of York for many years. And then, as Victoria said, just very recently, in the last couple of months, I've just made a move to work for Natural England. But I've always been lucky enough to work part-time, and in my spare time, I've been able to indulge my main hobby and passion, which is looking at botany and plants and biodiversity and natural history. So you can see me here out standing in a bog with the Natural History Society, Yoredale Natural History Society, looking at things and learning as much as I can about natural history. Here I am standing in another bog up on the top of Great Whernside, where I've got a kilometre square monitoring plot for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. And then here on the left, I'm again standing in some mud, this time down at the local farm where I help out during lambing time. And the reason I do that, not only to give me a kind of farmer's perspective on the whole thing of biodiversity, but because this particular farm is one of the last remaining low intensive farms in the whole of the Dales, really. And they have some of the most fantastic hay meadows, which are a joy to behold. Talking of which, here is a picture of a hay meadow. This one taken in June the year before last in the Upper Wharfdale Site of Special Scientific Interest up near Yockhamthwaite. And you can see just how marvellous it is. It's a riot of colour. There's many different types of plants there. There are many different types of grasses, loads of different plant species. You can't smell it, but it would be extremely fragrant. And you can't hear it from this photo, but it would be absolutely buzzing with insect life and a really dynamic ecosystem. And hay meadows are a bit of a man-made thing, really. They've evolved alongside traditional agricultural practices over many centuries. So when the farmer needed to have hay to keep his livestock over the winter, when the grass wasn't growing, he used to remove the livestock from the hay meadow at the start of spring, so sort of end of April-ish, allowing the grass and the sheep and cows would go up onto the higher fells where the grass was growing at that time of year. Then the grass in the meadow would start to grow, and eventually by sort of end of July it would be long enough to cut for hay. And alongside the grass, all sorts of different plants that could set seed alongside this life cycle would grow and flourish. The farmer wouldn't use any inputs apart from occasional applications of cow manure that he'd raked out of his barns. So when the cattle were then housed in the winter, they would be fed the hay that had been cut from these fields. And even though they're a kind of man-made phenomenon, they're incredibly species-rich hay meadows. And in fact, species-rich grassland like this is one of the most biodiverse habitats that we've got in the UK. As well as that, we're just starting to become aware of how much carbon they store. So it's only just becoming realised that traditional grasslands store absolutely loads of carbon and protect the soil. And I'm not that old, well, I'm fairly old, but I'm not that old. I can remember when there were loads more meadows like this, flowery meadows, not just in the national park, but outside the national park. And if you spoke to my granny when she was alive, she was actually born in 1906, she can remember fields that were so full of flowers, like cowslips, for example, that she would gather them up in a basket and make them into wine. And when she used to tell us stories like that, we almost couldn't believe that that was true. So even from my memory, when there was a lot more of these types of meadow, the meadows had already been depleted sort of by the 70s. And in fact, hay meadows like this are now so rare because 97% of the UK's wildflower meadows have been lost since the 1930s. So when I say been lost, I don't mean that they've all been paved over and made into houses and motorways, at least not in the national park anyway. What I mean is they've been lost from the traditional hay meadow management that led to this very species-rich biodiverse ecosystem to become improved for agriculture so that they're more productive for the farmer. And here you can see side by side two fields that have been treated differently. This was just over in Wharfdale near Kettlewell, actually from the Dales Way a few years ago in summer. So you can see that the field on the right is a more traditionally managed hay meadow. Excuse me. It's got lots of different flowers in there amongst the grass. You can see several different species of flower. There's plenty of food for insects that need to come and eat nectar from the flowers. On the left here, you can see that there aren't those flowers. This field's been sprayed off by the farmer and then reseeded with a more productive type of ryegrass that'll grow quicker, and his stock will convert it better into live weight for when they go to the auction. And because he's done that, and then he's applied fertilizer and he's upset the natural balance of the soil and the plant communities, and he's been in with a heavy tractor, you can see he's developed a bit of a dock problem here. So you can maybe just see there's a lot of weeds, docks growing, which aren't very good food for livestock. And he's going to have to come along now and spray those to get rid of them so that he can have more grass again. So although he's getting more outputs, he's also having to put in a lot more inputs. And that's, the story of modern agriculture, really. I'm not saying that it's the farmer's fault, because he's just responding to the current market situation, the current subsidy situation, and the demand for consumers for ever cheaper food, really. So why is it a problem if we lose all those flowers out of the meadows? Well, yes, they look pretty, but that's not the main point. The main point is they're, as well as being many different types of plant, they support many different types of insect. In fact, almost 1,400 different species of insects rely on meadow plants for their survival. So obviously the adult insects that fly around need the flowers to get the nectar from for their food, but also their larvae, so the caterpillars, they also need to eat plants. And some of them have very specific dietary requirements. So for example, this little moth down here, the chimney sweeper moth, its larvae will only eat pignut. And then the common blue here on the right and the green hair streak here, their larvae like to eat legumes like bird's foot trefoil and clover. The larvae of the elephant hawk moth, which you can see, there's the moth and there's the larva, they like to eat willow herb. And then larvae of some of our favourites like the peacock and small tortoise shell that we're all very familiar with and we like to see, their larvae eat nettles. So lots of different plants support lots of different insects. And these are just the colourful ones that we know more about because we see them often and we like to look at them. There's also loads of different insects that are, some of them very small, very hard to identify, very hard to spot, possibly some that we don't even know about yet, that are all part of this very diverse ecosystem. And they all have a role to play. So some of the insects are pollinators, which are useful for crops. Some of them might be predators of pest species. And some of them, of course, are food for birds and mammals and other organisms higher up the food chain. So why is it important if we don't have so many different types of insects? Well, of course, like I just said, they're the food for things that eat them, like birds, for example. And it's no coincidence that the populations of birds have really fallen as the populations of insects have fallen. And this can be directly related really to changes in agricultural practice, at least for the farmland birds. They've lost not only habitat for breeding, because in a silage field there's nowhere for them to nest, but they've lost such a lot of different types of food. And why is that important at the end of the day? Why does it matter if we lose biodiversity in this way? Well, we know that we're facing a climate and biodiversity emergency. Biodiverse communities are much more resistant to climate change, and it's important for them to be robust to resist that. As well as that, we don't know all the answers to some of the questions that we need to be asking, and probably we don't even know necessarily all the questions that we have. So our ecosystem provides some of the answers to questions that probably we don't realize we have yet. So it would be foolish to let it be destroyed. Recently with the COVID pandemic, it's been shown how much nature helps the mental health of the population. So that's another important aspect of why we need nature and biodiversity. And also, I think we have a duty really to not let species become extinct on our watch, and also to hand down the planet in a fit state to the next generation. So when agriculture becomes intensified and there's nowhere for wild plants to grow, or wild insects to feed, or birds to nest, or hares to bring up their leverets, we know that there's this focus now on what's left, and our focus is on roadside verges because they remain as an unimproved strip of grassland outside of the fields and adjacent to the road, where the farmers haven't actually had to improve that ground because it's not enclosed in their field system. So it's no good putting their livestock there because they would, get into the road and cause problems. So there was no point ploughing it and reseeding it. So very often the strips of wild habitat at the sides of the road are refuges and corridors for wildlife that used to live in the fields. Relics, if you like, of traditionally managed grassland. And with this in mind, about 10, 15 years ago, there was some funding available for a Yorkshire Dales Road Verge project, which was a collaboration between the Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority, the Wildlife Trusts and the County Council. And the project officer was James Ferguson from Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And over 3 years, James did absolutely brilliant, loads of work. He mapped all the road verges in the whole of the Dales. There are 1,600 kilometres of them. He found out where the most botanically rich verges were. There's 400 kilometres of botanically rich verge, and he named these special interest verges. And he did various trials involving different cutting regimes. He involved local communities to get involved with their own stretches of local verge, raising awareness, doing a brilliant job. But after 3 years, the project was over and the funding ran out, and that was the end of that really, apart from all the things that he'd learnt, which were substantial. So these were the typical things that he found out that affected road verges badly. From things like inappropriate planting. So people had been planting daffodils, say, to make their village look pretty, but daffodils aren't native and don't really hold many rewards in terms of nectar for insects. So they weren't really contributing very much to the idea of preserving the traditional habitat. Also, things like salt runoff from the piles of grit that they put at the side of the road to stop the cars slipping in the winter. That just destroys all the vegetation if it runs off over it. Inconsiderate parking. Well, I'm sure we can all say we've done that sometimes, where the vehicles have churned up the road verges perhaps. And then the main thing where the verges have been cut in the middle of summer, just as the plants have been really growing. The plants are just about to flower, and hey presto, they get cut to the ground. They have to start all over again. Usually there isn't time before they're cut off again, so they can't set seed, and then they can't come back the next year if they're annual plants. Perennial plants just get weakened and weakened and weakened until they eventually can't come back next year. And also leaving the cut grass on the top as a sort of thatch just encourages coarse weeds like nettles and thistles, because it's putting nitrogen back into the ground all the time as the grass rots down. So it just perpetuates the problem, and it over time reduces the diversity of the roadside verges. So you would just get grass, nettles, docks, thistles, and the original diverse flora would die out. Anyway, after the project had finished, that was kind of that, although there is that bank of knowledge and all those resources and data. But Plant Life, the national charity, have recently been running their own roadside verge campaign. And you can find out more about that on their website. But they've had about 133,000 signatories to their petition from people who want to see the verges managed better. They've been contacting councils and working very closely with district and parish councils to try and encourage better management of road verges. And they've produced a brilliant publication which you can download from their website, which contains a lot of practical guidance about the best practice for managing road verges. Their overall mantra being cut less and cut later. So armed with all this information, the background information from the Yorkshire Dales Road Verge project and Plant Life's campaign, we decided at Friends of the Dales that we should launch our own campaign, because quite a few of us have been noticing how the verges were always cut at the wrong time, and we'd been grumbling about it to the council for a long time, but nothing had really happened. So we decided to start with a fresh approach. So the first job was to find out who exactly was responsible for cutting all the verges in the Yorkshire Dales. So we went to look at the interactive grass cutting map on the North Yorkshire County Council website. And as you can see, it was by no means clear. The red areas, fair enough, were cut by the County Council, and the green areas were cut by the parish councils in those parts. And the yellow areas were cut by district councils, although we didn't have any of those in the Dales that cut the grass anyway. But then there was a lot of confusion. There was the grey area where it says no urban grass, whatever that means. The pale blue area to be confirmed, and the white area third party. So it was not clear to us at all who cut those verges. Having said that, we decided to focus on the North Yorkshire County Council areas because they were substantial in the park, and we'd had some conversations with them already. So we held a meeting with the Highways Department from the County Council and with representatives from Plant Life and the National Park in June 2020. It was a Zoom meeting because it was still the first lockdown. And it was a really, really productive meeting, actually. And we were very pleased with the way things seemed to be able to move forward. So the County Council asked us for some recommendations, which we gave them in consultation with Plant Life. And the idea being to try and optimise the time when they cut the verges so that they didn't destroy the diversity of plants and hence other wildlife in the verges. So we asked them, if possible, don't cut the verges at all between May and August. Just one cut per year would be best, and that should be in September. But however, if you can't avoid that because the grass grows and it's obscuring the road or whatever, do 2 cuts a year, and they should be as narrow as possible. So leaving as much of the verge uncut towards the wall side as possible, so that plants can still seed in that uncut part. And then it's quite important to cut the whole width of the verge in September to give it a proper cut, because that stops scrubby trees and perennial weeds from growing. And we asked them if they would let us establish 4 trial lengths of verge in their area, which corresponded to our previous special interest verges that had been identified in the Dales Verge project. And they seemed to be quite keen, but we got the feeling there were a lot of constraints. So when we're trying to think of what progress we've made, we have to consider it in that context. They had a new grass cutting contract which started last year, and it seemed to be difficult for them to translate what they wanted to the new contractors for some reason. They allowed us 3 trial sites in Craven district, and those are Horton to Southside and Ribblehead to Ingleton, and then Grassington to Hebden. And we monitored those quite carefully. But they said they would reduce the cutting width to 1 metre, whereas we'd asked for 0.5 metre, so that was a bit of a compromise. But they also said they couldn't change the actual cutting schedule, but they are working on that as an idea in the future. It just seemed too complicated for some reason, which we don't yet fully understand. So since then, we've been, like I say, monitoring our 3 trial sites. We've been recording the plants that grow there and recording when and how wide they've been cut. As you can see on this picture, this was the verge that was cut on the 14th of July. Wilf sent these pictures in. This is between Horton and Southside. And yes, they have cut it at the wrong time, really, but they haven't cut the whole verge. So they've cut off a lot of the melancholy thistles, but they haven't cut all of them. So perhaps there's a bit of hope there. And next year, well, this year and throughout the season, we'll be carrying on with this monitoring and recording data. We've got a baseline from last year's work, which we can then use to compare against when we can see how the situation's evolved. More recently, I've been having a conversation with my contact at the County Council, and he said that they're now becoming increasingly interested in this, and they've got their own ecologists working on it. And they're also even considering a cut and collect possibility, which sounds great. I mean, we'd assumed that they couldn't do that because of various reasons. They couldn't take off the grass cuttings because that would have to be treated separately as waste material, and it was all very complicated. But now apparently they are considering that. And I mean, that seems like a very sensible thing, because it could theoretically go into an anaerobic digester. And it would have the benefit of reducing the fertility of the verges so that the thick weedy grasses couldn't grow so quickly, and ultimately it would need cutting less. So we've made some progress with the County Council, perhaps not as much as we would have liked, but there are constraints, and things are looking a little bit hopeful. I think gradually kind of awareness is increasing, and now people are realizing more about biodiversity and how things don't have to just look tidy. They have to also be a habitat for other things to live in. So that's a little bit hopeful. As well as that, we've been publicising our campaign in our review magazine, and also in the local press and through social media. And we've been liaising with other organisations that are doing similar kind of campaigns. Some of them have made very nice posters, and we might steal some of these ideas to use in similar ways for ourselves, obviously in conjunction with the County Council's plans. And then, as well as that, we were bearing in mind that the parish councils often have responsibility for grass cutting. So we've been contacting the parish councils to see whether there's anything that they can do in regards to verge management. So Victoria's contacted 89 parish councils in the Yorkshire Dales or on the borders. I think at the last count we'd had about 8 positive responses saying that they were doing things and they were amenable to our ideas. There were a few negative responses about things like untidiness and local people not wanting, to change things. But I just included this picture it's actually from Horsehouse, and this is a village green in Horsehouse, which is a very sloping village green, but it's a village green nonetheless. And this wasn't, I know that the Horsehouse or Carlton Highdale parish meeting didn't reply to Victoria, but nonetheless, things are underfoot in terms of, things are underway in terms of improving the village grass management. So here you can see that this was taken last year in about early May, I guess. It was such a cold spring that the grass didn't grow very quickly, and instead loads of plants grew, revealing that this was actually a very nice piece of unimproved grassland. And because all these flowers grew, it became very attractive actually. So we persuaded the grass cutter, who happened to be my son, who had the contract, so it was a little bit easier for me to do. We persuaded him not to cut the whole lot, but to cut pathways through it and to cut some spots where people could have a picnic and to cut round the edges so that it looked cared for, but to leave plenty of it so that there was food for pollinators and other creatures. And he did this and it did look really, really nice. And we didn't get any complaints at all. In fact, everybody was very complimentary about how nice the green looked. And as the season progressed, he maintained these paths and maybe widened them a little bit. But the flowers that were growing changed in succession with the season. So it looked nice until about August when he was allowed to cut it all, because it did start to look a little bit scruffy. But the point is, as these plants were growing, they were providing a food source for insects like I've described, and as well as that, all sorts of other creatures. So there were snails in there and thrushes eating the snails. There were goldfinches coming to eat the seeds that were setting in the sward. So it was like an oasis of biodiversity, really, just in a fairly small area. Another thing we did was we contacted the Rotary Club of Richmond because we saw an article in the paper that they were running their Best Kept Village competition. And I've long thought that although the Best Kept Village competition is very nice, it's also very competitive, where people are competing to make their village as tidy as possible. And I think that can be of detriment to biodiversity. So we got in touch with them and spoke to them, and they seemed very keen on including some criteria in their list of judgments about the Best Kept Village that were based on biodiversity. So it would be things like, please consider leaving a small area of your green uncut. Please consider leaving, a stack of logs for beetles to live in and things like that. And they did seem to take that on board. So we're waiting to see whether that has any effect in this year's competition. And arising from that, we've made a list of guidelines designed to make people's villages more wildlife friendly. And as Victoria was saying, that's available on our website. So if you're interested in that, you can download it. At the same time, the churches were running a biodiversity project based on churchyards, which are also kind of forgotten areas of unimproved grassland, which can be very diverse for species. So we got involved with that and focused on Middleham Churchyard, where the county council, no, it's the district council, has responsibility for cutting the grass. And they always cut it really, really short, quite frequently over the summer. So we asked them if they would consider leaving some areas. We identified some areas that were quite biodiverse and asked them if they would consider leaving those to grow. And we roped them off with bits of string and they said, fine. And it was amazing what came up. All sorts of different plant species. And we had an event in there on a very hot day in June to encourage biodiversity and to make the public aware of what we were doing. We had buns and lemonade and games for the children and activities for them to do, just to raise awareness, really. And at the same time, myself and some members of Yoredale Natural History Society did a survey of all the plant species in the churchyard, and we found there was at least 39, not including the trees or the grasses, so just 39 flowering plants. So really that also was very interesting, and we should be doing that next year as well. It's just another strand to kind of increasing biodiversity in towns and villages. This was a photo taken by Anne Shadrick in Kettlewell, where the parts of the churchyard had been allowed to get long grass, and some interesting flowers had developed which looked very attractive, and I think they won an award from CPRE for having the nicest churchyard in Yorkshire or something. So overall, why are we doing all this? Well, of course, it's to address the biodiversity emergency, which goes hand in hand with the climate emergency. Whatever we can do, even if it's on a relatively small scale, can have quite big benefits for nature. And if we do things on a larger scale, like if we really did get all the road verges in the national park under suitable management, we could have a big effect. And there might also be cost savings for the respective councils if they're not having to cut the grass so often and spend money on diesel for their lawnmowers and tractors. Why are people sometimes reluctant to go down this road? Well, predominantly because they think it looks untidy. It doesn't have to look untidy. As we've said, you can take steps so that it doesn't. And really, you know, people's attitudes are starting to change about what untidy actually is. Obviously, children need a space to kick the football, if it's a village green, if they're allowed to. But you can leave a corner where the grass is longer and the flowers can grow. Some people cite safety concerns. Well, obviously we can't compromise on safety, in particular on road verges, but quite often safety has become something of a kind of tick box exercise. So that's to be avoided, really. We can't just say, well, safety, have to cut everything. It'd be much more sensible to have a more tailored approach. And then also, as I mentioned, there are various constraints relating to the contractors. So they have various limitations. Perhaps they're needing their equipment to be used by, you know, on the farm for certain times of the year, so they can't actually cut the road verges then, or the weather's not suitable or some other reason. So all in all, we are just considering everything in the equation, and it is really a matter of compromising, trying to do what we can, trying to encourage other people to do what they can, trying to raise awareness, and with the knowledge that whatever we can do is going to have a good effect on biodiversity. Even if it's only a small thing, it will have a fairly big effect, I think. So that's it, really. I would just like to thank all my friends and colleagues at Friends of the Dales, and also Tony Sargent at the National Park, Kate Petty from Plant Life, James at the Highways, and Reverend Liz, who's the Vicar of Middleham, who has been helping with the Middleham Churchyard project. And thank you all very much for listening.